Hello again, 110, and here is the second part of Chapter 4 in this video today. And just a quick note, if you're wondering why I'm looking down all the time, it's because I wear progressive lenses, and I don't know if I said it in the political science classes. I think I did. I don't, maybe not, or it was history. But just to clarify that, I got to find the focus point, and that's why I do that sometimes, and so I can see exactly what it is I'm reading. I sized this down from some of the previous outlines that I've used in the past, and I'm hoping that this will enable you to be more clear on what it is you should try to remember. There are basically 7 areas of the expansion of civil rights. In the previous video, we talked about civil liberties, protections against actions of originally the national government, and then as we get into the 20th century, because of the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment due process parts of those amendments, it's going to eventually be extended everywhere in American society. Equal protection of the laws applies to all citizens. And all of the Confederacy in the aftermath of the Civil War had to pass this amendment in order to be readmitted to the Union. So it's there from the 1870s on. 1870, I think, officially, is when the first Confederate states began to ratify this amendment. And by the Compromise of 1877, which officially ends Reconstruction, all of them had ratified it and been readmitted into the Union. Voting rights is one of the big areas where rights have been extended, and all of these different amendments are dealing with that expansion. 15, 17, 19, 22, 23. You could also add in Amendment 24, which outlawed the poll tax, but these are also some other ones as well. The 2-term limit was passed by the Republicans when they finally regained control of the Congress in the early 1950s as a way of getting back at the Democrats for controlling things for so long. And as we'll see in the course of this semester, the implications of the New Deal are still with us today, and that went on during the 4 administrations of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the last one of which he dies in April of 1945, and Harry Truman basically carries out with the Fair Deal many of the principles of New Deal Keynesian economics. The second big area is in racial discrimination and ending it. This really begins in earnest in the 1920s with Gitlow, who was protesting against the United States government and saying that it was really discriminating against citizens. And at that time, the court, as we saw in the civil liberties video, upheld his right to protest against the government, even though he was a socialist and a avowed communist. He is engaging in political speech, and political speech in the United States tends to be protected very heavily, as long as it does not incite to violence. Here are some of the other historical events that led to the political ending of racial discrimination. President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 47. In that same year, Jackie Robinson broke the color line in Major League Baseball, and at the end of the season, he was voted Rookie of the Year. The Hollywood movie 42 is very good. I highly recommend viewing that if you get a chance. In education, the door is going to be pushed open for ending segregation in education. The court, with the opinion written by Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, came to the conclusion that separate but equal is inherently unequal, which reversed the findings 50 years earlier in Plessy v. Ferguson, where they said that separate but equal was constitutional in that Louisiana railroad car segregation case. Later then in the 1950s, you have the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, who are attempting to go to the all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Governor Fauvus sent out the National Guard to prevent these 9 black students from entering that high school. Eisenhower was forced to respond as commander-in-chief. He nationalized the National Guard, and he also sends down the 101st Airborne, fully packing all of their equipment, to then escort these students to class. And this goes on for the rest of the year. And in the following year, Governor Fauvus closes those schools for the entire year. Unbelievable. Another big event was the Montgomery bus boycott, led by Martin Luther King Jr., which was very successful. And eventually the segregated seating on those buses was ended. The lunch counter sit-ins. Late 50s then, you have the national government finally getting in at the very end of the Eisenhower administration with the different civil rights commissions which are going to be enforcing voting rights that we talked about up here. And in the early 60s with the Freedom Summer Rides, the voter registration drives that were very volatile and violent in their implications, as many of these individuals were attempting to get African Americans registered to vote in the Deep South, and they met with violent responses. And this is when the federal government then gets heavily involved in desegregating, culminating after the Kennedy assassination with President Johnson pushing through the Congress the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which technically outlaws discrimination in employment. And there are other cases in your textbook involved with this, but this is the big act of the Congress which outlaws de jure discrimination. We still have de facto discrimination in the United States, ladies and gentlemen. It has existed always today. It is done by economics. People segregate themselves out by wealth. Rich people tend to live with rich people. Poor people live with poor people. And if you have an answer to that problem, ladies and gentlemen, you are a genius. The Voting Rights Act, as mentioned earlier, also outlawed the poll tax and other disenfranchisement tactics that are implemented in the late 19th century to get around some of the radical Republican social reforms that were attempted in the aftermath of the Civil War. And then that culminates in Plessy, which basically legalizes the segregated society for the next 50 years, even though the 14th Amendment is on the books. Grandfather clauses, they would ask you if your grandfather was allowed to vote. If you said no, you're not allowed either. And there were also, in some areas of the South, strict literacy tests that you would have to pass in order to be able to register to vote. Which is why at one time, the old Solid South that was called, if you won the Democratic primary, you basically won the election. Because nobody in the South, up through the late 1960s, would ever be caught dead voting Republican. The world has turned upside down since that time. Other areas of the expansion involve Title IX and opportunity in education. This has been going on since the early 1970s, the attempt to end gender discrimination in secondary and higher education. Much of the women's sports that exist now in higher education at the university level has its roots in this legislation. Soccer and basketball are very popular sports on many college campuses throughout the United States. The fourth area, called by the textbook the politics of rights, it relates to all of this and all of the ongoing arguments about all of these different areas. Another big area of expansion in the 1970s was affirmative action, which attempted to redress past discrimination through quota systems. And another big piece of legislation that was passed was the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, which attempted to outlaw all discrimination and attempted to make everyone equal. This failed to pass by 3 states in the necessary time, and it faded away by 1982. There was a reaction on the conservative right. Phyllis Schlafly and some other famous conservative women voted against this because they felt it was anti-family and anti other areas of American life, that they didn't feel that this was necessary given that the 14th Amendment is already on the books. Quotas were in the awarding of government contracts to minorities or in admission to public universities. It's an attempt to try to create a diversified economic awarding of contracts and a diversified student body. And that all began to wane in the Bakke case in the very late 1970s, 1979. And the court agreed with Mr. Bakke, who had tried to get into the University of California at Berkeley Medical School. He was denied entrance because of the quota system. He had higher test scores than the other applicants, the other minorities that were admitted instead of him, and he sued and he ended up winning his case. It's important that you know the Bollinger cases, which come after this, and the University of Michigan case from 2014, plus this latest one from January of 2016. They all deal with this idea of affirmative action in higher education. As of right now, the Roberts Court seems to be saying that this is something that needs to be solved on a state-by-state, case-by-case basis. There is no longer going to be an across-the-board affirmative action pushed by the federal government on down to the states or localities. In that 2014 case, they upheld some of the administration in the University of Michigan denying entrance to people based on the color of their skin. Again, that the court seems to believe that this is a type of reverse discrimination. We want to move towards being a merit-based society where education matters, where your skills matter, where what you know matters and what you bring to the table matters more than this idea of skin color. Another area of expansion of civil rights was in sexual or gender discrimination. Sexual harassment is clearly, the court is clear on this in saying that it is an outlawed practice. Asking for favors or quid pro quo favors in order to gain employment are outlawed. Sexual discrimination in employment is very difficult to prove. Is there a pattern? Then you might have a better case. And the Ledbetter case versus the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company is an interesting case in this particular sexual discrimination in employment area. The last big area is in immigration. This is going on right now, and it's far from clear where this is going in 2017. Are illegals going to be deported? Are they going to be denied, their children going to be denied benefits? You know, free public education, free medical care. Is the Trump administration going to build a wall between Mexico and the United States? It's very unclear at this point. There will be one more video for this chapter on the study guide, and you should be in good shape. Again, going back to the last video in the first part on civil liberties, make sure you are aware of these particular court cases that were identified. They are definitely on exam number 2.